Hello, my name is Anna and I'm an advocate for critical thinking. Today, I want to leave my 2 cents on the idea that the United Nations, or the UN in short, are a neutral source of truth that can be trusted uncritically. They're often positioned as a neutral source by media and politicians to provide political orientation, and I want to bust that myth and show you that opinions and decisions by the UN are just another biased perspective to be taken into account, of course, when forming your own opinion, but by no means the source of truth. And the reason for that lies in the fact that UN institutions more often than not represent the opinions of member states with values that many people in the West would consider immoral. Before I elaborate on that, let me give you an intro to the UN and its institutions to explain what it is, what it does, and how its opinions are formed, because I feel that most people have a vague idea of the UN but are not in the details. But those are important to understand, I think, to put their public statements and resolutions into perspective. So the UN is an international organization, as you know, which was founded in 1945 as a response to the Second World War to improve peace in the world, basically. It currently consists of around 190 member states, 193 to be precise, and these are all fully sovereign and fully internationalized, internationally recognized countries in the world, except for Vatican City. So the UN really represents the world's countries. And its mandate was later expanded beyond peace to also provide humanitarian assistance and promote social progress and human rights. Today, as many of you will know, it addresses various global challenges that are difficult to tackle at national or regional level, such as humanitarian crisis, refugee flows, diseases, international terrorism, climate change, and so forth. There are dozens of UN organizations with different focus areas and more than 100,000 permanent staff, which does not take into account the many local organizations and NGOs who support the implementation of UN work on the ground. I looked at the different functions of the different UN organizations in a nutshell to give you an overview of what all these organizations do, and I think they broadly fall into 4 categories. The first one is direct political decision-making. The second one is sharing political opinions to influence global governments without any hard power. The third one is practical, technical, and military support for peace and development. And the last one, and also the smallest one, I think, is research to support global policymaking. Let me give you some details on each of these functions. The first function that I mentioned before is direct political decision-making. It's actually only one of the many UN organizations that have actual political decision-making power. It's a heavyweight, but it's only one, and that's the Security Council. It's responsible for maintaining international peace, and the members of the UN Security Council consist of 5 permanent members with veto power and 10 non-permanent members that change every 2 years. The 5 permanent members currently, or probably permanently, as the name implies, are China, France, Russia, the United Kingdom, and the United States. The Security Council is the only UN organ with the authority to make decisions that member states are obligated to implement. The second type of function of the UN is sharing political opinions to influence global governments. There are multiple organizations that don't have any decision-making power, but who have influence on the opinions of governments and media. Their words have moral authority, so to say. And you will be familiar with many of them. The 3 most important I'd like to call out here for your information is, firstly, the General Assembly. This is the main deliberative organ of the UN. It's kind of the parliament of the United Nations, if you will. I'm sure this is not technically accurate, but just to give you an association. It consists of representatives from all member states, each with 1 vote. The outcome of their conferences are so-called resolutions, and you will have heard about that. The second kind of institution with soft power that I wanted to share is the International Court of Justice. It's located in The Hague, and it handles legal disputes between the different UN member states. It consists of 15 judges, or its panel consists of 15 judges elected by the General Assembly and Security Council for 9 years, and these judges come from all over the world. And the third institution within that cluster of soft power is the Human Rights Council. It has 47 members from different regions that are elected every 3 years. It meets for at least 10 weeks every year to discuss thematic human rights issues and country-specific situations, respond to emergencies, make recommendations how to better implement human rights, and so forth. The third function, which you will for sure be familiar with, because this is what many people associate with the UN, is the practical, technical, and military support on the ground for peace and development. For example, the so-called blue helmets for peacekeeping, development funding through UNDP, the development program for, just to give you one example, projects such as building wells, UNHCR to support refugees, UNICEF for children, WHO for health, UNRWA for Palestine or Palestinian refugees, or UN Women to foster women's rights. And lastly, the fourth function, and I'm just mentioning this for completion, is research to support global policymaking. Examples might be the Human Development Index, which is an index that is used to rank countries based on their levels of human development, as the name implies, which is defined by factors such as a long and healthy life and knowledge, standard of living, and so forth. And another example for research might be research on climate change to inform national policymaking. So after this intro, what is the purpose of all these institutions? As I mentioned in the beginning, the overall purpose of all UN organizations is to ensure global peace and foster international cooperation on global problems that are difficult or impossible to tackle at national or regional level. And the way the UN does this is in two ways. On the one hand, it acts as an impartial facilitator of dialogue and kind of a referee, like in a football game between the nations. And secondly, on the other hand, the UN also represents the world community, the member states. To some people, this combination of impartial judge and representation of the world community seems to make the United Nations some sort of an ultimate source of truth, which is why media, you will often hear or read references to UN analysis of global issues without providing any alternative perspectives. But to me, actually, these two mandates just tell me that the UN's mission has an inbuilt contradiction, because I think an institution cannot be an impartial referee and representative of its members at the same time. So, of course, the UN can never be impartial, in my opinion, but it's just a spokesperson for the average view of the world's countries. If the United Nations were a scientific institution without any political mandate and a mission to only produce evidence-based policy recommendations, I would not mind this blind followership or criticize it here, but this is not the case. Instead, its opinions are being guided by its members. And these members have their own agendas and values, which will more often than not be democratic or human rights oriented, or otherwise in line with Western values, which many of you will have. First of all, according to the Democracy Index of 2020 from the Economist Intelligence Unit, there are only 23 full democracies in the world. So only 12% of the UN members, if you extrapolate this to all the members of the UN Assembly, are full democracies. But every one of these states has equal voting rights in the General Assembly. Within the UN organizations, my impression is that larger and Western countries de facto have a higher influence than smaller and developing countries. I don't think it's just an impression. I think it's probably written down in some charter, which I cannot quote at this moment. But I'm saying this with some confidence. But this UN still strives for equity among country influence via quota and voting mechanisms, for example. So I'm not criticizing this intention. My main point is that the assumption that the UN represents predominantly democratic values based on its member states is just not accurate. As we have seen, the Security Council is the exception to this rule, with less countries holding power. But even there, only half of the core members are democratic, and among the temporary members, only a minority will typically be democratic. Let me give you another indicator for the mentality of the countries who the UN represents: the Human Freedom Index. The Human Freedom Index is one of the most used tools used to measure to what extent human rights are implemented in the countries of the world. It uses a simple scale from 0 to 10, where 10 is the best and 0 is the worst. And according to that index, 44% of the world's countries score above 7, which seemed like a reasonable limit to me to judge if a country is doing okay-ish in terms of human rights. This also means that 56% of the member states of the United Nations are countries with limited human rights. Another question which I would actually be very interested to know about is also the political affiliation of UN staff. UN employees are obliged to be impartial and not to be politically active or outspoken, which makes total sense given their mandate. But of course, I think these are just people and they will have an opinion. I actually used to work for the UN for a bit and occasionally joined social gatherings afterwards. And based on my experience, the average political opinion in the UN was left-leaning. I'll never forget, just to share one anecdote, I'll never forget when I attended a reception which took place during the US elections, I think in 2012, and the shock that went through the room when I said, half seriously and half provokingly, that I supported the Republican Romney rather than Barack Obama. But admittedly, this is just my personal anecdote rather than a reliable piece of data. But it doesn't change the main argument anyway. It doesn't change my key point, which is that the UN is the members behind it, not some sort of independent institution. So when the General Assembly passes resolutions, it's the average view of mostly unfree and undemocratic states. When the Security Council passes a resolution, it's the view of its 5 permanent and 10 temporary members. The UN Security Council, by the way, has also been found to be biased towards supporting parties of conflict that sustain higher casualties, rather than following the principle of cause or fault. What I mean by this is that the party of the conflict with more deaths on their side will typically be supported more, even if, for example, they were the ones who started the conflict. The UN Human Rights Council is also not neutral. Its 47 members are elected by a majority vote in the General Assembly in a secret ballot. You may say that this is only true, like this bias is only true for political institutions where they represent the opinions, but not for objective institutions such as the International Court of Justice, which adheres to international law rather than the opinions of its members. But even the opinions of the International Court of Justice have been criticized to be biased. According to a study from 2005 in the Journal of Legal Studies, strong evidence was found that, firstly, judges favor the states that appoint them, and that, secondly, judges favor states whose wealth level is close to that of their own states. And I'm not saying that this bias does not occur in any other institutions. I'm just saying that the UN should enjoy the same degree of critical thinking and criticism and questioning as any other institution in the world. And especially with the UN, these kind of biases have a real strong impact on global politics and public opinions. Here are just some examples. The first one is the most obvious bias in action by the UN, and it's their position on Israel. There are numerous examples for a strongly negative Israel bias in UN institutions, and one example is the Agenda Item 7 of the Human Rights Council. So the Human Rights Council has a standing agenda of 10 items, and Agenda Item 7 is only about resolutions condemning Israel's treatment of Palestinians. No other country in the world, meaning no other country of the 193 countries in the world, gets this kind of attention, no matter how severe and obvious their human rights violations are. Just let that sink in. Another example in that area, in this Israel area, comes from the UN General Assembly, which has adopted 155 resolutions on Israel and just 81 on any other country since 2015. Yet another example comes from the recent failure of UN Women to acknowledge the videotaped rapes and murders of Israeli women on the 7th of October by Hamas and its supporters. Or the labeling of UNRWA, the Palestinian Refugee Organization, of civilians in Gaza as refugees based on the fact that their parents or grandparents left Israel, often voluntarily, in the 40s. Or their labeling of residential areas, as a result of that, as refugee camps today. Or the denial of terrorist centers inside UNRWA-run schools and hospitals. There are many more examples in this domain. But let me give you another cluster of examples where you see this bias of the UN in action, and that's when they take unfair positions that are not weighted based on the influence of individual countries. For example, China, which has led, based on the criticism I've read, to a lack of acknowledgement of Taiwan as an independent state with a right for UN representation, or influencing the development support that's given to Africa by the UN in such a way that it supports China's agricultural interests in the continent. Now, I'm sure there are many different opinions on this, but if you go by like the majority criticism of UN that you read in media and analysis, these are some of the key points that I pointed out. And of course, it not only applies to China, but also to other countries, which is a logical result, to be fair, of the way the UN is designed in terms of its membership representation. A third area that you will probably be familiar with, a third kind of failure of the UN, so to say, it's its passive behavior in armed conflicts, where interests of its member states were apparently not strong enough to enforce an action. And famous examples are the Rwanda genocide in 1994, the Darfur conflict between 2003 and 2008, or the war in Syria, where the UN stayed mostly passive in these brutal conflicts and was criticized for putting the geopolitical interests of its members above its own mission, which is defined in the UN Charter. There are numerous other examples. The bottom line, what I'm trying to say is that the UN is just another source that needs to be questioned and checked just like any other source, rather than believe blindly. So when you hear a statement of a UN official in the news or a reference to the UN's opinion without any further context in the media, just remember what kind of countries and values stand behind them, and ask yourself whether these are your values as well. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.